You didn't plan to become this. No single moment turned you into someone who feels too much and says too little. No trauma large enough to justify it. No event you can point to and say, that's when everything changed. And yet, you changed. You became careful, distant, aware of things others don't notice. You learned to observe before speaking, to withdraw before being hurt, to think 3 steps ahead of every interaction. You became someone who lives inside their own mind more than inside the world. Carl Jung spent decades studying why this happens, not the surface reasons, the psychological structure beneath it. He wasn't interested in what you think caused it. He was interested in what actually built it. Because you didn't choose this consciously, but you built it unconsciously, layer by layer, response by response, until one day you woke up and realized, this is who I am now. And the question isn't whether you like it. The question is, do you understand how it happened? Jung worked with patients who couldn't explain why they felt distant from their own lives. They functioned well, held jobs, maintained relationships. But something inside them had gone quiet, and they couldn't say when it started. He found a pattern. These people had learned at some point that certain parts of themselves created friction. Their intensity made others uncomfortable. Their needs felt like burdens. Their honesty generated tension. So they adjusted. They didn't make a formal decision to hide. They simply stopped bringing those parts into conversations, stopped expecting to be understood in certain ways, stopped reaching for connection that required too much explanation. The adjustment worked. Life became smoother. Interactions became predictable. But something else happened. The parts they stopped expressing didn't vanish. They remained active internally, and over time those unexpressed parts grew more articulate than anything they said out loud. You know this already. You have entire conversations in your head that never happen in real life. You think through possibilities, responses, outcomes, and then you say nothing. The gap widened. What you think became increasingly separate from what you show. What you feel became harder to translate into words anyone else would recognize. And eventually you stopped trying. Jung experienced this himself. He wrote about it in his private journals, the sense that his internal life had become so developed, so specific, that bringing it into the external world felt almost impossible. What you've learned not to show doesn't disappear. It develops independently. It becomes more coherent to you and less communicable to others. You didn't bury these things out of fear. You buried them out of pragmatism. At some point you realized the cost of being fully known is higher than the cost of being partially hidden. So you chose partial, and now, years later, you live with the consequences. You interact, but from a distance. You connect, but only to a point. You're present, but not entirely. The version of you that moves through the world is functional, competent, manageable. The version of you that exists internally is something else entirely. And the distance between them defines almost everything about how you experience your life. Jung noticed something else in his clinical work. The people who appeared most composed on the outside often carried the most chaos internally. The ones who seemed calm in conversation experienced storms of thought when alone. The ones who projected certainty lived with persistent doubt. He called this compensation, the psyche balancing itself in ways you don't control. When you suppress something in one direction, it intensifies in another. You learn to stay measured in your speech, so your internal monologue became relentless. You trained yourself not to react emotionally in public, so your emotional life moved entirely inward, where it runs without interruption. This isn't about repression in the traditional sense. You're not pushing things down out of shame. You're redirecting energy, and that energy has to go somewhere. It goes into hyper-awareness, into analyzing every interaction after it ends, into replaying conversations, dissecting what was said, what wasn't said, what was meant, what was assumed. You became the kind of person who can't let things rest. Even small exchanges linger. You notice tones, pauses, word choices. You read into things others forget immediately, and this makes you exhausted. Jung worked with patients who described this exact fatigue, not physical tiredness, cognitive depletion, the result of running two parallel tracks at all times, what's happening externally and what's happening in your interpretation of it. The compensation isn't optional. Your psyche does this automatically. When you constrict expression outward, the internal pressure rises. And it rises silently without announcing itself until one day you realize you can't turn your mind off. You lie awake, replaying moments from years ago. You rehearse things you'll never say. You build entire arguments with people who have no idea you're upset. This is the cost of the split. The energy you don't release externally doesn't vanish. It circulates, it loops, it becomes the background hum of your existence. And here's what makes it worse: you're good at it. You've trained yourself to live this way so thoroughly that you don't recognize it as abnormal anymore. The constant mental activity feels like clarity. The overthinking feels like depth. The isolation feels like self-sufficiency. Jung saw this too. The people who adapted this way often became highly functional, intelligent, perceptive. They developed skills in observation, analysis, pattern recognition, but they paid for it in rest, in ease, in the ability to simply be without commentary. You can't experience something without simultaneously analyzing your experience of it. You can't relax without noticing that you're trying to relax. You can't connect without monitoring how the connection is going. The compensation runs in the background of everything you do, and it doesn't stop when you want it to. Years of clinical work revealed something unexpected. The patterns people carried weren't always theirs. They were inherited, not genetically, psychologically. Your parents had their own unresolved tensions, their own unexpressed fears, their own ways of managing what they couldn't process. And without meaning to, they passed the template to you. You learned emotional restraint by watching someone who never fell apart. You learned hypervigilance by growing up around someone who seemed calm but radiated tension. You learned that certain feelings were acceptable and others were not, simply by noticing which ones got acknowledged and which ones got ignored. You absorbed psychological patterns before you had language for them, before you could question them. They became the foundation of how you process the world, and now you repeat them. You withdraw when overwhelmed, the same way someone in your family withdrew. You overthink before acting, the same way they hesitated. You hold yourself to impossible standards, the same way they punished themselves for falling short. You didn't choose this consciously. You internalized it before you knew what internalization was. Adults who couldn't explain why they carried certain anxieties, why they responded to stress in specific ways, why certain emotions felt forbidden even when no one was enforcing the rule anymore. The answer wasn't in their memory, it was in their lineage. The unprocessed psychology of one generation becomes the automatic psychology of the next. What your parents couldn't resolve, you inherited as a baseline. What they feared, you learned to fear without understanding why. You defend it. When someone suggests you're too hard on yourself, you justify it. When someone points out that you don't need to carry everything alone, you dismiss them. When someone offers help, you reflexively refuse. These responses aren't decisions, they're inherited reflexes. There's a documented case of a father, a religious figure who lived with profound doubt but never expressed it, who performed faith publicly while struggling privately, who maintained composure at the cost of authenticity. His son recognized those same patterns in himself decades later. The need to appear certain while feeling uncertain. The performance of stability while managing internal conflict. He didn't blame his father. He simply saw the transmission clearly. Your parents didn't fail you. They gave you what they had. And what they had was incomplete, unresolved, passed down from their own parents, who received it from theirs. You're not the first person in your family to feel this way. You're just the first one paying attention to it. What starts as adaptation eventually becomes identity. You spent years adjusting to the world around you, learning what worked, what kept you safe, what allowed you to function without constant friction. And at some point, those adjustments stopped being temporary. They hardened into who you are. You no longer withdraw as a strategy. You withdraw automatically. You no longer overthink as a precaution. You overthink by default. You no longer hold back to protect yourself. You hold back because that's what you do now. The flexibility is gone. When you were younger, you could still access other modes of being. You could be spontaneous, even if rarely. You could take risks, even if it made you uncomfortable. You could let your guard down, even if only briefly. Now, those options feel unavailable. It's not that you've forgotten how to be open. It's that openness no longer feels like a real possibility. The pathways have closed. The habits have set. The person you became through repetition is now the only person you know how to be. This is what calcification does. It turns adaptation into rigidity. You can see it in how you respond to new situations. You already know how you'll handle them before they happen. You'll observe, you'll assess, you'll participate minimally. You'll leave early if possible. There's no variation anymore, no experimentation, no trying a different approach just to see what happens. You've optimized yourself into a fixed position, and the strange thing is, it works. You're competent, reliable. You manage your life effectively. You don't create problems for others, you don't fall apart. But you also don't grow. Growth requires vulnerability. It requires trying things that might not work. It requires exposing parts of yourself you're not sure how to explain. And you've built an entire existence around avoiding exactly that. The clinical term for this is rigidification, the psychological equivalent of a joint that stops moving. It's not injured, it's not damaged. It simply stopped being used in certain ways, and over time it lost the capacity for those movements. You've lost range. There are emotional registers you can no longer access, social possibilities you can no longer imagine. Ways of being that feel so foreign now they might as well belong to someone else. And the worst part, you don't miss them. You've adjusted to this version of yourself so completely that you've stopped remembering there were other versions. You've normalized the narrowness, you've made peace with the limitation until something disrupts it. A conversation that goes deeper than usual. A moment where someone sees past your presentation. A flash of recognition that you're living at half capacity. And for a brief moment, you remember what it felt like before the calcification set in. Before you became this efficient, this controlled, this small. If this is landing somewhere familiar, subscribe. The work here goes deeper than what fits in a single video. You've spent years analyzing yourself, understanding your patterns, naming your tendencies, explaining to yourself why you are the way you are. And in all that analysis, you missed something. You became so good at observing yourself that observation replaced action. You studied the problem until studying became the solution. You know why you withdraw. You understand the psychological mechanics. You can trace the lineage back through your family. You can explain the compensation, the inheritance, the calcification. And none of that knowledge changed anything. You still do it. You still pull back. You still overthink. You still live at a distance. The understanding didn't free you. It gave you better language for the cage. This is the trap of self-awareness without application. You see the pattern clearly. You describe it accurately. And then you continue performing it, now with full consciousness of what you're doing. Which is worse, at least before you could claim ignorance. Now you watch yourself repeat the same behaviors while knowing exactly what they cost you. Why? The honest answer, the one you avoid, is that knowing doesn't obligate you to change. You can live indefinitely in the space between awareness and action. You can understand yourself completely and still choose the familiar discomfort over the unfamiliar risk. Insight feels productive, it feels like progress. It gives you something to think about, something to discuss, something to return to when you're alone. But it's not movement. It's circling. You've replaced experience with comprehension, and the more you understand, the less you need to do anything differently. There's a clinical term for this: intellectual defense, the use of insight as avoidance. You explain yourself so completely that testing whether things could be different becomes unnecessary. People do this for years, decades even. They read, they reflect, they build elaborate frameworks for understanding their own psychology. And their actual behavior remains untouched. The framework becomes what they show others: evidence of effort, proof of seriousness. But effort directed entirely inward produces no external shift. You can spend a lifetime becoming an expert on yourself while your life stays the same. The analysis deepens, the vocabulary expands, the explanations become more precise, and nothing moves. There's a difference between understanding why you are the way you are and deciding whether you'll stay that way. One is observation, the other is choice, and choice doesn't wait for perfect clarity. It doesn't require you to resolve every question first. It happens in the middle of uncertainty, when you're still figuring things out. You don't need a complete map of your psychology to take a different action. You just need to notice the next time the reflex appears and do something other than what you've always done. Not as a grand transformation, as a single deviation. You're in a conversation and you feel the urge to withdraw. You notice it, and instead of following it automatically, you stay, just for 30 seconds longer than usual. You're about to filter what you're going to say. You catch the impulse, and you say the unfiltered version. Once. You're preparing to decline an invitation because it feels easier to stay home. You pause, and you go anyway. These moments don't feel significant while they're happening. They feel small, awkward, uncomfortable, but they're the only place change actually occurs. The years you spent building this version of yourself happened through small repetitions, the same decision made over and over until it became automatic. Reversing it works the same way. Small repetitions in the opposite direction. You don't dismantle calcification all at once, you interrupt it, repeatedly, until the interruptions start to form their own pattern. This isn't about becoming a different person. It's about expanding the range of who you already are. You don't stop being cautious. You learn when caution is useful and when it's just habitual. You don't stop thinking deeply. You learn when reflection serves you and when it's just avoidance. You don't abandon the system you built. You stop letting it run you, and that requires something you've spent years minimizing. Risk, not reckless risk. Calculated discomfort. The risk of saying something that might not land well. The risk of being misunderstood. The risk of reaching for connection and having it not work out. The risk of being visible in ways you can't fully control. You've avoided this for good reasons. Visibility has costs. Exposure can hurt. Misunderstanding is exhausting, but invisibility has costs too. And at some point you have to weigh them honestly. The life you've built is safe, manageable, predictable, and it's smaller than what you're capable of. Not because you lack ability. You're intelligent, perceptive, capable of depth most people never approach. But you've contained all of that within a framework designed to protect you from discomfort. And discomfort is where expansion happens. You don't have to like it. You don't have to want it. But if you want something different than what you have now, discomfort is the price. There's no version of this where you grow without feeling uncertain, where you connect without risking rejection, where you become more of yourself without exposing parts you've kept hidden. The question isn't whether you understand this. The question is whether you're willing to act on it. You became this way through 1,000 small adjustments. You'll become something else through 1,000 small deviations, not all at once, through repetition in a different direction. The pattern is visible now. What you do with that visibility is up to you.